"We did not order for your son." "My sister," Tiana said, handing him a lukewarm hot dog on a flimsy paper plate while her own children feasted on $500 Wagyu beef and imported caviar. My mother looked at me with cold disdain and added, "You should have packed him something from home." I did not scream or cry. I simply stroked my 9-year-old son's hair, smiled at my family, and said, "Noted." When the waiter returned with the check, I stood up and made one single announcement that made the entire room go dead silent. "I am Nia, 32 years old, and I spent my entire life as the designated failure of my family. As a highly successful founder of an artificial intelligence firm, I eventually escaped their toxicity, but I maintained occasional contact just to keep the peace." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy suburb meant projecting an image of absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway, was a fortress of impossible expectations. From elementary school through high school, I maintained perfect grades, joined honor societies, and still remained entirely invisible to my parents. Tiana was the golden child. She was 3 years older than me and possessed a natural manipulative charm that kept my parents completely wrapped around her finger. When Tiana failed a class, my parents bought her a new car to cheer her up. When I won a state science fair, my father told me to stop being a nerd and learn how to do my makeup so I could find a rich husband. That lifelong dynamic of blatant favoritism and emotional neglect culminated in the worst way possible last Friday night. The reservation was at a highly exclusive 5-star steakhouse in downtown Chicago. We were gathered to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. The restaurant was a fortress of polished mahogany wood, dim romantic lighting, and massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the pristine white linen tablecloths. Securing a table at this establishment usually required months of advanced planning or knowing the exact right people. Brent, my sister Tiana's arrogant white husband, made sure everyone in our party knew he had pulled personal strings with the general manager to get us the private dining alcove. I had driven across town through heavy traffic with my son Leo. We were both dressed in our absolute best clothes, and I was silently praying to simply survive the evening without a major confrontation. I took my seat near the far end of the long table, placing Leo carefully beside me, so I could buffer him from the inevitable passive-aggressive comments. At the head of the table sat Brent, projecting the aura of a king holding court in his own castle. Tiana sat right beside him, dripping in obvious designer labels and wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet she made sure to flash every single time she reached for her water glass. My parents, Dorothy and Marcus, flanked them on either side. They looked at their son-in-law with a level of pure adoration and respect they had never once directed toward me. Brent owned a local corporate logistics company that, according to the carefully crafted family narrative, was highly successful and immensely profitable. Tiana fed off this dynamic entirely. She used his supposed wealth to secure her position as the undisputed queen of our family tree. I was their favorite punching bag. In their eyes, I was just the quiet, struggling single mother who barely made ends meet working a basic human resources job. I never bothered to correct them about my actual career. They had no idea I had built a tech company from the ground up and sold a minority stake for millions. I kept my wealth hidden because I knew exactly how their greed operated. Brent took complete control of the evening long before the heavy leather-bound menus were even distributed to the guests. He waved the head waiter over with a dismissive flick of his wrist. I already took the liberty of pre-ordering a special tasting menu for the table, he announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighboring tables. The waiter nodded respectfully, gathering up the menus from the empty place settings. I raised my hand slightly to get the waiter's attention, wanting to ensure there was a suitable option for Leo and to check for any potential food allergies. Before I could even speak a single word, Tiana reached across the table and patted my arm, with a deeply condescending smile. "Do not worry about it, Nia," she said smoothly. "We handled absolutely everything. You just sit back and enjoy a luxury meal you could never afford to buy on your own." I bit my tongue and offered a tight smile. I told myself to endure the disrespect for the sake of my parents' anniversary. I wanted Leo to have a normal family experience, even if my family was anything but normal. The first course arrived in a highly choreographed procession of heavy silver trays. The waiters presented beautiful plates of beluga caviar, gold leaf, garnished oysters, and perfectly seared scallops. The conversation around the table immediately shifted to Brent and his endless business triumphs. He talked at length about his recent corporate acquisitions, his expensive golf trips with local politicians, and his aggressive plans to buy a second vacation home in the Hamptons. Marcus nodded in deep, reverent respect, hanging on every single word his son-in-law spoke. It was a familiar, exhausting performance designed solely to reinforce the strict hierarchy of our family. Wealth equaled respect, and in their eyes, I possessed neither. As the appetizer plates were cleared away by the attentive staff, Dorothy turned her sharp attention directly to me. The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees as she looked me up and down, clearly unimpressed by my understated navy blue dress. "Are you still working that boring desk job, Nia?" she asked, making sure to project her voice so the waiters could hear. I carefully placed my linen napkin on my lap and met her critical gaze. "I am still working in the tech industry, Mom," I replied calmly. Dorothy sighed heavily, a sound full of theatrical disappointment, and looked over at Tiana. "It is just a terrible shame you never pushed yourself," Dorothy continued. "You were so incredibly smart in high school. Now look at you just scraping by while your sister is helping run a massive corporate empire. You really should consider lowering your pride and asking Brent for a basic administrative position at his company." Tiana chimed in right on cue, eager to twist the knife. "I do not know if she could handle the fast pace, Mom. Remember when Dad had to co-sign her first car loan because her job did not pay nearly enough to cover the monthly payments? It was a complete and utter fabrication. I had paid for my first reliable car entirely in cash using money saved from my college internships. But in this toxic family environment, the truth was whatever made Tiana look superior and made me look incompetent." Marcus grunted his firm agreement, taking a slow sip of his expensive bourbon. "We all make our own choices in this life," he said coldly. "Some people choose success, and some people choose to be a permanent burden." I simply nodded, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. I poured Leo a glass of water and quietly asked him about the science fiction book he was reading for school, shielding him from their venom. The main course approached the table with even more grand fanfare than the appetizers. A line of 6 waiters carried heavy silver cloches surrounding our dining alcove in perfect unison. On the count of 3, they lifted the shining silver domes. The rich aroma of expensive truffles, roasted garlic, and perfectly seared meat filled the air. In front of my parents, Tiana, Brent, and their 2 teenage children sat massive cuts of authentic A5 Wagyu beef. Beside the steaks were butter-poached lobster tails and delicate chocolate soufflés meant for a sweet contrast. It was a decadent, beautiful culinary spread that easily cost over $500 per plate. Everyone at the table gasped in delight, offering lavish, fawning praise to Brent for his incredible generosity. Tiana's teenagers immediately began taking pictures of their food for social media, completely ignoring everyone else. Then I noticed the final waiter standing directly beside Leo. He did not hold a shining silver cloche. He held a flimsy white paper plate. With a look of deep, profound discomfort, the waiter gently slid the paper plate onto the pristine white linen tablecloth directly in front of my 9-year-old son. On the cheap plate sat a lukewarm, shriveled hot dog inside a plain grocery store bun. Next to the hot dog was a small handful of generic crushed potato chips. There was no garnish, no side dish, no elegant presentation. It was just a stark, cruel contrast to the magnificent feast surrounding him. Leo looked down at his sad plate, then looked up at me with wide, confused, and deeply hurt eyes. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" he whispered, his small voice breaking my heart into a million pieces. "You did absolutely nothing wrong, my sweet boy," I whispered back, squeezing his shoulder. The entire table went dead silent for a fraction of a second before the loud clinking of expensive silverware resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. I kept my voice perfectly level and calm as I looked up at the waiter. "Excuse me," I said clearly. "There seems to be a major mistake with my son's order." Before the waiter could even offer a polite apology, Tiana's voice cut sharply through the dining room. "There is absolutely no mistake, Nia," she said, cutting into her tender Wagyu beef. "We did not order for your son." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer magnitude of her cruelty. "You ordered a $500 meal for your teenagers, but you specifically went out of your way to request a paper plate and a hot dog for your nephew," I asked, my voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. Tiana rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine. "His palate is entirely uncultured," she stated smoothly. "Brent should not have to pay $500 for a gourmet meal a child will just push around his plate and waste. Besides, he likes hot dogs. I am doing him a favor by giving him something familiar." I stared at my sister, watching her chew her expensive, perfectly cooked food, while my beautiful son stared at a meal that had clearly been purchased from a cheap street vendor outside and brought into the high-end restaurant just to humiliate us. Brent leaned back in his plush leather chair, swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. He looked at me with a sickening smirk that made my blood run absolutely cold. "Tiana is completely right," he said casually. "I am not running a charity organization here, Nia. You should be immensely grateful I even allowed you to attend a private anniversary dinner I am paying for out of my own pocket. It is not my job to feed another man's kid high-end cuisine. If you wanted him to eat well tonight, you should have worked much harder in life instead of settling for mediocrity." The sheer audacity of the disrespect hung heavy and toxic in the air. I looked toward my parents, expecting at least a token defense of their innocent grandson. Instead, Dorothy actively leaped to defend Tiana and Brent. "Do not sit there looking so ungrateful, Nia," my mother scolded harshly. "A single mother working a basic desk job shouldn't expect luxury from her successful brother-in-law. You should have packed him something from home if you knew he would be hungry. It is incredibly rude of you to make a scene when Brent has been so incredibly generous to our family. He even paid for the valets tonight." Marcus banged his heavy crystal glass against the wooden table, the sharp cracking sound demanding absolute submission from everyone present. "I will not have my 40th anniversary ruined by your bitter jealousy." "Naya," my father commanded, his face red with anger. "Sit down, keep quiet, and let us enjoy this beautiful meal. You have embarrassed this family enough over the past 15 years. Do not dare do it tonight." He turned back to Brent and raised his glass in a celebratory toast, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that his youngest grandson was sitting quietly with a paper plate in front of him, trying hard not to cry. I looked around at the faces at the table. I saw the smug, victorious satisfaction plastered on Tiana's face. I felt the arrogant, toxic entitlement radiating from Brent. I absorbed the cold, unwavering rejection from the people who were supposed to be my loving parents. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice to yell. I did not storm out of the restaurant in a dramatic fit of rage, giving them the chaotic reaction they wanted. I simply turned to Leo, placed my hand gently over his small, trembling hand, and offered him a warm, deeply reassuring smile. "Noted," I said softly, looking back at the adults who had just sealed their own miserable fates. I pulled my phone from my purse and waited patiently for the waiter to return with the massive bill, quietly preparing the very first move in a high-stakes game they did not even know they were playing. The time for shrinking myself to fit into their abusive narrative was officially over. Tonight they were going to learn exactly who they were dealing with. The plates were finally being cleared away by the silent and efficient staff. The remains of the decadent $500 steaks and the hollowed-out lobster shells sat as a testament to the gluttony of my family. Greg leaned back heavily in his leather chair, rubbing his stomach with a look of supreme satisfaction. He signaled the sommelier to bring a round of aged cognac for the adults, completely ignoring the fact that I had not touched a drop of alcohol all evening. I kept my arm wrapped securely around Leo. My son had finished his sad little hot dog in silence, sensing the heavy tension in the air. I kissed the top of his head and told him how proud I was of his excellent behavior. He was displaying more grace and maturity at 9 years old than the 4 adults sitting across from us combined. Vanessa was busy applying a fresh coat of expensive lipstick using the reflection of her silver butter knife. She chattered endlessly about her upcoming kitchen renovation, making sure to drop the names of high-end Italian marble suppliers so that the neighboring tables could hear just how wealthy she supposedly was. My mother Brenda nodded along eagerly, completely absorbed in the fantasy world her golden child had constructed. My father Calvin was deep in conversation with Greg about corporate tax loopholes, treating his son-in-law like an absolute genius of modern finance. None of them paid any attention to me. I was exactly where they wanted me to be, silent, marginalized, and pushed to the very edge of their glittering world. But the illusion was about to shatter. The head waiter approached our alcove carrying a sleek black leather folder. He placed it delicately on the table directly in front of Greg. The moment had arrived. Greg picked up the folder with a grand, sweeping gesture. He opened it slowly, letting his eyes scan the itemized list of premium steaks, imported seafood, and vintage wines. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head with a theatrical chuckle. $4,800, he announced to the table, making sure his voice was loud enough for everyone to appreciate his financial burden. A steep price for a Tuesday night, but nothing is too good for my wonderful in-laws on their anniversary. My mother clasped her hands together over her heart and actually beamed at him. "You are far too generous, Greg," she cooed. "We are so incredibly blessed to have you in this family." Greg reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. He tossed it onto the leather folder with a sharp clack that echoed in the quiet space. The waiter offered a polite bow, picked up the folder, and retreated toward the payment station. Vanessa patted Greg's arm affectionately. "You always take such good care of us, honey," she murmured. "I just watched them." I kept my face entirely blank, holding back the bitter laugh that was building in the back of my throat. I knew the fragile house of cards they were sitting on. I just needed the wind to blow. Less than 2 minutes later, the waiter returned. His professional smile had slipped just a fraction, replaced by a look of careful, practiced discretion. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into Greg's ear. I watched the arrogant smirk instantly vanish from Greg's face. A flash of genuine panic darted across his eyes, before he quickly masked it with a look of deep annoyance. "What do you mean it did not go through?" Greg snapped, his voice slightly louder than he intended. The waiter kept his tone completely neutral and professional. "The terminal declined the transaction, sir. Perhaps there is a daily limit or a fraud alert on the account. We can certainly try another form of payment." Vanessa stopped admiring her reflection in the knife. She looked at her husband with a sudden, sharp intensity. Greg cleared his throat, adjusting his collar nervously. "It is definitely a fraud alert," he said quickly, looking around the table to assure my parents. "You know how these banks are. The moment you spend over $4,000 at dinner, they freeze everything, thinking the card was stolen. It is actually a great security feature." He laughed, but the sound was hollow and strained. He reached into his wallet again and pulled out a different card, a standard gold rewards card. "Run this one," he instructed the waiter, waving him away dismissively. "Just put it through and let us wrap this up." The waiter took the second card and walked away. The atmosphere at the table had fundamentally shifted. The easy, arrogant banter had dried up. Calvin was staring at Greg with a slight frown, his heavy brow furrowed in confusion. Brenda picked up her water glass, her hand trembling just a little. Vanessa was staring intensely at the tablecloth, completely silent. I simply sat there with Leo perfectly still, waiting for the second shoe to drop. When the waiter returned this time, he was not alone. The general manager of the restaurant, a tall, imposing man in a pristine suit, walked directly to our table. He was holding the leather folder. Greg's face lost all its color. The manager leaned down, placing the folder gently on the table. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the manager said, and his voice carried a quiet firmness that brokered no argument. That card has also been declined by your financial institution. Do you happen to have a third method of payment we could try? The silence that descended upon our table was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a lie being exposed under bright lights. Greg stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He patted his pockets frantically, muttering under his breath about banking errors and incompetent customer service representatives. Vanessa grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit fabric. "Greg, what is going on?" she hissed through gritted teeth. "Use the corporate account." "I cannot use the corporate account for a personal dinner, Vanessa," he snapped back, his voice rising in panic. "Just give me a minute to log into my banking app." But there was no banking app that could fix this. I knew that, and deep down, they knew that. The facade was crumbling in real time. My mother, Brenda, looked around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of the other wealthy patrons sitting nearby. She was terrified of the public humiliation. Her eyes darted frantically around our table before landing directly on me. The panic in her eyes instantly morphed into cold, familiar entitlement. "Nia," my mother commanded, her voice urgent and demanding. "You need to pay this bill right now." I slowly turned my head to look at her. I raised one eyebrow, maintaining my calm demeanor. "I need to pay for the $4,800 dinner that I was explicitly excluded from," I asked quietly. "Do not play games with me right now," Brenda hissed, leaning across the table. "Greg's bank is obviously making a stupid error, and we are making a scene. Take out your debit card and pay the manager. You can use that little savings account you are always hoarding. Greg will write you a check tomorrow morning to reimburse you." It was a breathtaking demand. They had spent the entire evening humiliating me, mocking my career, and deliberately starving my child to make a cruel point. Now faced with their own financial ruin and public embarrassment, they expected me to empty my modest savings to rescue them. They truly believed my only purpose in life was to absorb their failures and fund their delusions. Calvin chimed in, his voice taking on that familiar authoritative boom. "Do as your mother says, Nia. You owe this family for all the grief you have caused us over the years. Step up and handle this situation before we look like fools." I looked at the restaurant manager, who was standing there awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamic playing out in front of him. I reached for my small, understated clutch purse. I opened the clasp slowly and deliberately. Vanessa let out a long, shaky breath of relief, believing I had caved to their demands as I always had in the past. She believed I was about to hand over the meager savings of a struggling human resources worker. Instead, I reached inside and pulled out a heavy, matte black metal card. I placed it onto the white linen tablecloth. It landed with a solid, distinct thud that echoed in the quiet alcove. It was an American Express Centurion card, the infamous black card. A card issued by invitation only to individuals possessing extraordinary wealth and spending power. The manager recognized it instantly. His posture immediately straightened, and his expression shifted from uncomfortable pity to profound, absolute respect. Vanessa stared at the heavy black metal card sitting on the table. Her eyes widened so far, I thought they might pop out of her head. The color completely drained from her face. She looked from the card to me, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. Greg stopped tapping his phone. He stared at the card, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He knew exactly what that card represented. He knew the financial requirements needed just to hold it in your hand. "Where did you steal that?" Vanessa suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the dining room. Several people at nearby tables turned their heads to stare at us. "You are a complete fraud. You are a college dropout. 10 years ago, you came to my apartment begging me for $500 to pay your rent so you and Leo would not get evicted. You are a human resources clerk. Where did you get a fake black card?" Her outburst was a desperate, pathetic attempt to force reality back into the shape she preferred. She used my most vulnerable moment from a decade ago, a moment when I was struggling with an abusive ex-husband, to try and strip away the power I was currently holding. But her words meant absolutely nothing to me now. That struggling, terrified young woman she remembered was long gone. I had spent the last decade building an empire while she spent it spending her husband's borrowed money. I completely ignored my sister's frantic screaming. I looked directly at the restaurant manager and offered him a polite, serene smile. "Please take this card," I instructed him, my voice carrying clear and steady over the sound of Vanessa's heavy breathing. "I want you to charge exactly $4.50 to this account. That will cover the cost of the plain hot dog and the tap water that my son consumed this evening." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the terrified faces of my parents, my sister, and her fraudulent husband. As for the remaining $4,795.50, I continued, "You will need to leave that balance for them to figure out. They enjoyed the Wagyu beef and the vintage wine. They can figure out how to pay for it." The manager nodded respectfully. He picked up the heavy black card, completely ignoring Greg's outstretched hand. "Right away, madam," the manager said, bowing slightly before turning to walk toward the payment station. Pandemonium erupted at our table. Brenda slammed her hands down on the table, knocking over an empty wine glass. "Nia, you cannot do this!" my mother screamed, abandoning all pretense of wealthy decorum. "You cannot leave us sitting here with a $5,000 bill. We do not have the money to cover this. You have to pay the whole thing. You clearly have the money now. You owe us." Calvin stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "If you walk out of this restaurant without paying this bill, you are no longer a part of this family," my father roared, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You will never set foot in our house again." I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I reached down and took Leo's small, warm hand in mine. My son was looking up at me with quiet awe. He had never seen me stand up to his grandparents before. He had never seen me look so powerful. I looked my father dead in the eyes, feeling absolutely no fear, no guilt, and no regret. "That is the best anniversary gift you could possibly give me," I said softly. I looked at Vanessa, who was currently hyperventilating into her cloth napkin, realizing that her entire life of luxury was a complete sham that had just been exposed to the entire family. I looked at Greg, who was staring at his phone, desperately trying to find a loan company that would approve a $5,000 transfer at 9 o'clock at night. "I hope you all brought comfortable shoes," I said to the table at large, my voice dripping with cold, hard finality. "Because I have a feeling the kitchen staff is going to need you to wash a lot of dishes tonight to work off that Wagyu beef." I turned my back on them. I did not look back. Holding my son's hand, I walked away from the alcove, away from the screaming, the begging, and the toxic entitlement that had poisoned my entire life. The manager met me near the front entrance, handing me my receipt and my black card with a look of profound admiration. "Thank you for your business, madam," he said quietly. "Have a wonderful evening." I tipped the valet generously and helped Leo into the back seat of my luxury SUV, a car I kept parked far away from my parents' house whenever I visited to avoid their probing questions. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor feeling like absolute freedom, my phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my mother, Brenda. The message was typed in frantic, desperate capital letters. "Turn around and come back to this restaurant and pay this bill right now, or you are completely disowned and out of this family forever. You are a selfish, ungrateful monster, and I will never forgive you for embarrassing us like this." I stared at the glowing words on the screen. A decade ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-loathing. I would have turned the car around, emptied my savings, and begged for their forgiveness. I would have sacrificed my own stability to maintain the illusion of their love. But tonight was different. Tonight, the heavy chains of familial obligation had finally snapped. I deleted the message. I put the car into drive and pulled out into the cool, dark Chicago night. The city lights blurred past the window as we drove toward the lakefront, leaving my family stranded with the massive bill they had so arrogantly racked up. It was the first strike in a war they had started years ago, and I was finally ready to finish it. The morning sunlight reflected brilliantly off the surface of Lake Michigan, casting a peaceful golden glow across the expansive living room of my penthouse. I stood at the custom marble kitchen island, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee and watching my son Leo eat a plate of warm strawberry pancakes. After the incredible tension and cruelty of the anniversary dinner, the night before this quiet morning felt like a profound sanctuary. I had finally drawn a hard line in the sand, and for the first time in my 32 years of life, I felt entirely free from the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. The silence of the morning was suddenly shattered by a loud, aggressive pounding on the heavy oak double doors of my entryway. Building security always called the intercom before allowing anyone up to the private residential floors, so I assumed it was just a package delivery from the regular weekend concierge, who sometimes brought items directly to the door. I set down my coffee mug and walked across the wide expanse of polished hardwood flooring. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, expecting to see a uniform. Instead, I found my mother Dorothy and my sister Tiana standing in my private elevator lobby. Tiana was holding an oversized designer tote bag and wearing a matching luxury tracksuit, while my mother stood stiffly in her Sunday church clothes. They had clearly bypassed the new weekend security guard by lying about a family emergency or pretending they had been explicitly invited up. Before I could even ask how they got into the building, my mother aggressively pushed her way past me, stepping directly into the entryway. Tiana followed right behind her, bumping my shoulder intentionally as she walked inside. They had ambushed me, expecting to find the cramped, rundown apartment they always assumed a struggling single mother would live in. Instead, they stepped into a $3 million luxury penthouse that occupied an entire half floor of the high-rise building. I watched as they both stopped dead in their tracks. The sheer magnitude of the space completely paralyzed them. Their eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Tiana stared at the expensive minimalist furniture, the custom art hanging on the walls, and the sleek modern kitchen where Leo was quietly finishing his breakfast. I could see the physical, visceral reaction spreading across Tiana's face as her eyes rapidly calculated the immense cost of everything in the room. The smug superiority she had carried just 12 hours ago at the steakhouse completely evaporated, replaced by a burning toxic jealousy that made her hands tremble. Dorothy's mouth dropped open in profound shock before she quickly forced her features into a harsh, bitter scowl. She could not handle the undeniable visual proof that the daughter she had always deemed a failure was living a life of wealth and luxury that completely eclipsed their own. Instead of showing even a single ounce of remorse for their vile behavior the night before, my mother immediately went on the offensive. She turned to me, her face red with indignant rage, and demanded to know why I was selfishly hoarding this level of wealth. She yelled that it was an absolute disgrace for a daughter to hide her success, while her family was working their fingers to the bone just to maintain their businesses. She paced across the expensive rugs, waving her arms and accusing me of being a deceptive, manipulative liar. She said I had deliberately humiliated them at the anniversary dinner just to show off my secret money. According to Dorothy's deeply twisted logic, I was not a victim of their cruelty, but rather a sociopath who had intentionally trapped them into looking foolish. She claimed that a good Christian daughter would have shared her blessings openly with her family, instead of hoarding them like a greedy dragon in a glass tower. Tiana immediately caught on to our mother's manipulative strategy and joined in playing the ultimate victim. She dropped her heavy, oversized designer bag onto the entryway console table with a loud thud and began to force dramatic tears into her eyes. She sobbed that her husband, Brent, was not actually a cruel man, but rather a victim of extreme corporate stress. She claimed that Brent's logistics company was currently facing a severe but temporary cash flow problem due to unforeseen supply chain disruptions in the market. She cried that Brent was carrying the heavy weight of the world on his shoulders, trying desperately to provide a good life for his family and keep his employees paid. Tiana sobbed that I had been incredibly malicious and entirely unfeeling to publicly humiliate a stressed man over something as trivial and unimportant as a hot dog for my son. She twisted the narrative so perfectly, making it seem as though Brent's horrific abuse and classist insults were simply the understandable byproducts of a hardworking man going through a tough quarter. Dorothy stepped forward, positioning herself as the generous peacemaker who was willing to fix this massive family rift. She placed her hands flat on my marble kitchen island and told me that despite my terrible deception, they were willing to forgive me. She said they would graciously welcome me back into the family fold and pretend the entire black card incident at the restaurant never happened. But she noted that true forgiveness required actionable proof of loyalty. Dorothy looked me dead in the eyes and said that family always helps family in times of desperate need. She told me to go to my office and get my checkbook right now. She demanded that I write a personal check for $100,000 immediately to serve as a bridge loan to help Brent's company make their upcoming payroll. She framed this massive extortion attempt as a simple apology fee, stating it was the absolute least I could do to make amends for the profound disrespect I had shown my father and my brother-in-law. She expected me to fall back into my lifelong role of the subservient scapegoat eager to buy my way back into their conditional toxic love. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the absolute sheer audacity of their demands. I looked at my mother, who was waiting with her hand outstretched, expecting a massive check. I looked at my sister, who had completely stopped her fake crying and was now staring at me with greedy, expectant eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or anxiety. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. I walked slowly around the kitchen island, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and took a long, slow sip. I looked at the two women who had tormented me for my entire life, and I finally used their own cruel, toxic words right back at them. I told my mother and my sister that I was not running a charity organization. I looked directly into Tiana's shocked eyes and told her that I should not have to pay for investments that will just go to waste. I kept my voice perfectly level and calm as I informed them that if Brent wanted to keep his logistics business afloat, he should have worked much harder in life instead of settling for total mediocrity. I told them that my wealth was not a community fund to bail out arrogant men who like to bully 9-year-old children over a plate of cheap food. I told them my money belonged to me and to Leo, and they would never see a single dime of it as long as they lived. The absolute shock on their faces was a beautiful thing to witness. Dorothy gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. Tiana turned a deep shade of crimson, her fists clenching so tightly at her sides that her knuckles turned white. They simply could not process the reality that their favorite punching bag was standing in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, throwing their own toxic words right back into their faces. The illusion of their control over me shattered completely and instantly. Tiana lost whatever remained of her composure and started screaming at the top of her lungs, calling me a selfish, vindictive monster who would die alone because I would never be a real part of this family. Dorothy began threatening me again, saying she would call their pastor and all of our extended relatives to tell everyone what a horrible, ungrateful child I had become. She promised to ruin my reputation in our hometown and ensure that no one ever spoke to me again. I simply turned my back on their tantrums, walked directly to the heavy oak front door, and pulled it wide open. I told them their time was up, and they needed to leave my property immediately before I called building security to have them physically escorted out for trespassing. Dorothy and Tiana looked at my unbothered expression and realized I was entirely serious. I would not hesitate to have them thrown out of a luxury high-rise in front of all my wealthy neighbors. They hastily gathered their things, snatching up their purses and coats with jerky, angry movements. Tiana marched toward the door, grabbing her oversized designer bag from the entryway console table. As she passed me, She deliberately bumped her shoulder as hard as she could against mine, walking out into the private elevator lobby with a loud huff. Dorothy paused at the threshold, giving me one last long look of pure, undiluted hatred before turning on her heel and following her golden child. I stood in the doorway and watched them until the heavy metal elevator doors finally slid shut, taking them down to the street level and out of my life. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt, leaning my forehead against the cool wood as I let out a long, slow breath. The toxic, chaotic energy they had brought into my home slowly dissipated, leaving the penthouse quiet and peaceful once again. I walked back into the main living area to check on Leo, who had wisely retreated to his bedroom with his book when the screaming started. After making sure he was okay, I walked back toward the front door to tidy up the entryway. I stopped in front of the modern console table, where Tiana had dropped her massive bag. Sitting on that table was a small, polished silver tray where I always kept my important daily mail. I reached out to straighten the small stack of envelopes, but I immediately noticed that something was deeply wrong. The neat stack was messy and disorganized, as if someone had hurriedly and carelessly shuffled through it while I was distracted in the kitchen. A cold spike of dread hit the bottom of my stomach. I quickly sorted through the remaining envelopes, scanning the return addresses and the formal printed names. My breath caught in my throat. A very specific, highly confidential piece of mail was missing from the tray. It was a thick, sealed envelope from my corporate bank that had arrived the previous afternoon. Inside that specific envelope were the updated banking routing numbers, highly sensitive account details, and primary authorization access codes for my cybersecurity firm's main operating fund. I closed my eyes and perfectly pictured the scene from just 10 minutes ago. I remembered Tiana standing right next to that console table when they first pushed their way inside the apartment. I remembered her dropping her oversized designer bag directly on top of the silver mail tray, obscuring it from my view, while Dorothy yelled at me from across the room. The terrifying realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. They did not just come to the penthouse to insult me and beg for a $100,000 handout. They came to steal from me. For 48 hours, the silence from my family was absolute and completely unnerving. After discovering the missing envelope from my entryway console, I immediately contacted my bank to place a strict temporary freeze on all my personal accounts. I spent the entire weekend looking over my shoulder, jumping at every single notification on my phone, and waiting for the inevitable disaster to strike. My cybersecurity firm was preparing for a major software launch, and I tried to bury my anxiety in endless lines of code and strategy meetings to keep my mind occupied. But the heavy knot of dark dread in my stomach never went away. I knew Tiana and my mother had not stolen my banking details just to cause a minor inconvenience or to simply snoop through my finances. They were planning something massive and devastating, and I was entirely blind to their timeline. On Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after they had ambushed my penthouse, the crippling blow finally arrived. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex client contract when my personal cell phone began vibrating frantically across the glass surface. It was the direct emergency line for the senior vice president of my corporate banking division. I answered the call with a sinking feeling of absolute terrible certainty. The banker informed me that a massive commercial loan application had just been processed and fully approved by a partner institution. My stolen financial portfolio had been used to secure a $500,000 commercial bridge loan for Brent's failing logistics company. Tiana and Brent had blatantly forged my signature, listing me as the primary financial guarantor for a $500,000 debt. They had used the highly sensitive authorization codes from the stolen envelope to bypass the initial security checks, proving to the lending institution that I had the liquid assets to cover the massive loan if Brent's company defaulted. The sheer brazen audacity of their crime left me temporarily paralyzed in my office chair. They had crossed a massive, unforgivable legal line. This was no longer just toxic family drama or emotional manipulation at a fancy steakhouse. This was federal financial fraud identity theft and a deliberate calculated attempt to completely destroy the financial security I had spent a decade building for myself and my son. I thanked the banker, instructed him to lock down every single corporate asset immediately, and ended the call. The cold, numb shock quickly gave way to a burning, absolute fury that consumed my entire body. I grabbed my car keys, told my executive assistant to cancel all my afternoon meetings, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to my parents' suburban fortress took 45 minutes, but it felt like mere seconds in my heightened state of rage. My mind raced with 1,000 different scenarios trying to figure out how Tiana and Brent could have possibly bypassed the strict notary requirements for a commercial loan of that staggering size. The bank would have absolutely required a certified legal witness to verify my identity and my signature before finalizing the financial documents. They could not have done this alone. They had help. I pulled my luxury SUV into the long, sweeping circular driveway of my parents' pristine colonial home. The manicured lawns and the expensive cars parked outside looked like a twisted, pathetic mockery of the moral decay festering inside the walls of the house. I did not bother knocking on the front door. I still had the spare key they had given me years ago, mostly so I could come over and clean their house or run tedious errands for them when I was struggling to make ends meet. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped into the quiet, immaculate foyer. The house was completely silent and smelled faintly of expensive floral room spray. I walked purposefully down the long hallway toward my father's private study, the room where he spent his evenings hiding from my mother and managing his own investments. I pushed open the heavy oak door of the study without knocking, letting it hit the wall with a loud thud. My father, Calvin, was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk wearing a plush cashmere sweater and casually swirling a glass of premium scotch. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the expensive wooden blinds, illuminating the smug, satisfied expression plastered completely across his face. He did not look surprised to see me at all. In fact, he looked exactly like a man who had been patiently waiting for a trapped animal to finally realize it was caught in a snare. I stood in the doorway, my hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at my sides, and looked at the man who was supposed to protect me from the evils of the world. "You helped them," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady in the quiet room. "You helped Tiana and Brent forge my signature on a $500,000 commercial loan." Calvin took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, letting the expensive liquor linger before setting the heavy crystal glass down on his leather desk pad. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with cold, unfeeling eyes that held zero remorse. "I did not help them forge anything, Nia," he replied smoothly, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "I simply acted in my official capacity as a licensed notary public. I verified the documents that were placed on my desk to ensure the survival of our family legacy. Brent's company needed capital immediately, and you have more than enough wealth sitting idle in your accounts. It was the only logical solution to a temporary cash flow problem that was threatening your sister's happiness." The absolute sickness of his rationalization made my chest tight with a mixture of grief and pure hatred. "You deliberately falsified legal documents," I stated clearly, wanting him to hear the harsh reality of his profound crime. "You illegally notarized a forged signature to steal $500,000 from your own daughter just to bail out your golden child and her arrogant husband because you care more about their fake wealthy image than you do about my actual life." Calvin slammed his hand down on the desktop. The sudden sharp noise meant to intimidate me into immediate submission. "You owe us," he roared, his face turning a deep shade of angry purple as he pointed a thick finger at my chest. "You owe this family for all the deep shame and endless embarrassment you caused us when you were younger. You dropped out of our lives, you refused to marry a respectable, wealthy man, and you humiliated us by having a child out of wedlock with that deadbeat loser Darren. We provided you with a solid roof over your head growing up, and this is how you repay us. by hoarding your secret millions while your own sister struggles to keep her head above water. You should consider that $500,000 loan a simple repayment for everything your mother and I have endured because of you. I stared at my father, realizing with absolute clarity that there was no boundary he would not cross to protect Tiana and punish me. He genuinely believed that my hard-earned wealth belonged to the family collective to be distributed according to his toxic, broken hierarchy. I am reporting this massive fraud to the authorities right now, I told him, pulling my phone from my pocket and holding it up. You, Tiana, and Brent are going to face federal prison time for identity theft and wire fraud. I will not let you destroy my life to fund her fake luxury lifestyle. Calvin's arrogant smirk returned, stretching across his aging face like a venomous snake preparing to strike. He picked up his scotch glass again, completely unbothered by my threat of legal action. If you go to the police, he said softly, taking another sip, I will testify under oath that you came to my office and willingly signed those loan guarantor documents yourself. I will swear on a Bible that you were heavily intoxicated at the time, acting erratic and deeply unstable. The room felt suddenly freezing cold. I looked at the monster sitting behind the desk, unable to comprehend the bottomless depth of his absolute depravity. Calvin leaned forward, resting his arms heavily on the desk, his eyes locking onto mine with ruthless, terrifying calculation. I will tell the investigators all about your history of severe postpartum depression after Leo was born. He continued, his voice dark and threatening in the quiet room. I will gladly provide them with the medical records showing how you struggled to cope, how you cried for weeks, how you were barely able to take care of your own child and had to beg your mother for help. I will paint a perfectly vivid picture of a deeply unstable, unpredictable woman who willingly signed a loan for her sister in a drunken stupor and then maliciously fabricated a story about identity fraud just to ruin her family out of bitter, lifelong jealousy. Who do you think a judge will believe, Nia? A respected, wealthy businessman with a spotless community reputation and decades of civic service, or an estranged, bitter single mother with a heavily documented history of mental instability? He was using my darkest, most vulnerable moments. The terrifying months after Leo's birth, when I suffered from severe chemical imbalances and begged my parents for emotional support, as a weapon to completely destroy my credibility. He was threatening to gaslight the legal system itself to protect Tiana's stolen money and keep me entirely under his control. The sheer evil of his blackmail attempt was suffocating. But instead of breaking me into pieces, as he clearly intended, his words had the exact opposite effect. The last lingering threads of my familial loyalty completely burned away, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened steel and a thirst for absolute ruin. I looked at the man who contributed to my DNA and realized he was absolutely nothing to me anymore. He was just a desperate criminal sitting in a nice house trying to play God. You have vastly underestimated me, Calvin, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. You think you have backed me into a corner by threatening to expose my past struggles to the world? But you forgot one critical detail about my life. I built a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity empire by learning exactly how to expose corrupt, fraudulent people just like you. You just handed me the match to burn your entire world to the ground. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on his smug face and walked out of the study, leaving him alone with his scotch and his pathetic delusions of control. I walked briskly down the long, silent hallway, the heavy front door clicking shut firmly behind me. The crisp, cool afternoon air hit my face as I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, breathing deeply to steady my racing heart. I needed to get back to the city to assemble my legal team and prepare for the absolute war that was about to consume all of our lives. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my parked SUV, focusing entirely on my next strategic moves to freeze the loan and secure my assets. As I reached for the door handle, a plain, nondescript gray sedan pulled up smoothly behind my car, blocking me in. A tall man wearing a cheap wrinkled suit and carrying a thick manila envelope stepped out of the vehicle and walked purposefully toward me. He did not look like a neighbor or a random delivery driver. His eyes were fixed entirely on me, tracking my movements with practiced professional precision. He asked if I was Nia, holding the thick envelope out toward my chest. I replied that I was taking a cautious step back against my car door. He thrust the envelope into my hands with a quick, practiced motion. "You have been officially served," he stated flatly before turning around and walking quickly back to his idling gray sedan. I stood alone in the driveway of my parents' house, the heavy manila envelope feeling like a solid lead weight in my trembling hands. My heart began to pound, a completely different kind of primal dread washing over my entire body. I tore the flap open and pulled out the thick stack of official legal documents inside. The bold black text at the top of the first page blurred for a second before coming into sharp, horrifying focus. It was an official petition for emergency full physical and legal custody of my son Leo. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my eyes frantically searching for the name of the petitioner. There it was, printed clearly in the center of the page. Darren. My deadbeat, abusive ex-husband, who had not paid a single cent of child support or bothered to see Leo in over 6 years, was suddenly suing me to take my child away. My hands shook violently as I flipped wildly through the thick stack of legal filings, trying to understand how Darren could possibly afford the massive legal fees required to launch an emergency custody battle of this staggering magnitude. I reached the very last page of the petition, finding a copy of the official law firm's retainer fee receipt. My breath completely caught in my throat as I stared at the payment authorization line. The non-refundable $50,000 legal retainer had not been paid by Darren. Printed clearly across the bottom of the receipt, right next to the signature line, was the name of the person who was funding the absolute destruction of my life. Tiana. My sister had paid my abusive ex-husband to come and take my son away from me. The heavy frosted glass doors of Evelyn's downtown corner office slid shut with a soft, definitive click, sealing us inside a soundproof fortress of legal strategy. The morning sunlight reflected brilliantly off the surface of Lake Michigan, casting a harsh, revealing glare across the expansive, polished mahogany conference table. Evelyn was a high-powered, ruthless family law attorney whose reputation made opposing counsel physically sweat before they even entered the courtroom. She did not lose cases, and she certainly did not tolerate frivolous extortion schemes masquerading as legitimate custody disputes. I sat directly across from her, placing the thick manila envelope I had been served in my parents' driveway onto the pristine glass surface. The custody petition felt like a toxic radioactive object radiating malice and deception, but my hands were completely steady. I had spent the entire night analyzing every single terrifying angle of this ambush. Evelyn opened the file, and her sharp, dark eyes scanned the dense legal jargon with practiced, ruthless efficiency. She flipped through the pages of Darren's absurd claims, her manicured finger tracing the lines of text that accused me of being an unstable, neglectful mother. She reached the final page, pausing and tapping her expensive silver fountain pen against the law firm's retainer fee receipt. The receipt bearing my sister Tiana's distinct, arrogant signature. "This is an incredibly sloppy, poorly executed blackmail attempt," Evelyn stated, her voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "It is a classic proxy attack. Your sister is actively funding a deadbeat father to threaten your primary physical custody. She wants you terrified, isolated, and desperate so she can force a favorable settlement. She knows Darren has no legitimate legal standing, but she is banking on your emotional terror to bypass the legal system entirely." I looked out at the sprawling city skyline below, feeling a profound, chilling clarity settling deep into my bones. The betrayal had burned away all my fear, leaving only a cold, calculated desire for absolute ruin. "Tiana does not want a simple financial settlement," I explained quietly, folding my hands on the table. "She wants total legal immunity. She and her husband Brent forged my signature on a $500,000 commercial loan using my stolen financial documents. My father Calvin illegally notarized those forged documents to seal the deal. They committed massive federal wire fraud and identity theft to save Brent's failing logistics company. Now she is using Darren to hold my son Leo hostage, so I will be forced to sign a retroactive financial authorization, making the massive loan completely legal. She thinks she can trade Leo's safety for her own freedom, and $50,000 is a cheap price to pay to avoid federal prison. Evelyn leaned back in her plush leather chair, a cold, predatory smile slowly spreading across her face. They have severely miscalculated, she said, her eyes glinting with the thrill of the impending legal slaughter. They assume you are still the frightened, vulnerable woman who divorced this abusive man 6 years ago. They do not realize they just handed us a perfectly documented federal conspiracy charge wrapped in a neat little bow. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously deconstructing the intricate, malicious layers of Tiana's desperate, multi-pronged attack. Tiana knew exactly what she was doing by dragging me into a prolonged, highly publicized custody battle. She knew it would trigger the deepest unhealed traumas from my past. She vividly remembered the debilitating, terrifying postpartum depression I suffered after Leo was born. She knew how incredibly terrified I was of losing my child back when I had absolutely no money, no career, and no emotional support system. Tiana fully assumed that the mere threat of a vicious courtroom battle led by a high-priced shark attorney would make me instantly cave and sign away the $500,000 just to keep Leo safe from the crossfire. She thought my maternal instincts would override my desire for justice. But Tiana fundamentally failed to understand that the frightened, broken woman she remembered no longer existed. In her place sat the founder and CEO of a massive artificial intelligence and cybersecurity empire. I did not just have vast, untraceable wealth. I had unparalleled access to digital information and a team of highly trained experts who could uncover the darkest secrets of anyone on the planet. I left Evelyn's office and spent the next 24 hours locked inside the secure server room of my penthouse, deploying my senior investigative team to tear Darren's entire pathetic existence apart. Darren was always a reckless, arrogant man who thought he was infinitely smarter than everyone else in the room. He operated with a clumsy, bloated ego that left a digital trail so wide and so painfully obvious that my top security experts almost felt deeply insulted by the absolute ease of the breach. We did not even have to look hard to find the rot festering beneath his surface. Darren had been secretly running a highly illegal, lucrative sports betting ring out of the back room of a failing local auto body shop. He had accumulated massive, crushing offshore gambling debts, routing the money through shady cryptocurrency wallets and offshore shell accounts in a pathetic, transparent attempt to hide the illicit transactions from the Internal Revenue Service. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to very dangerous, ruthless people who did not care about court dates or legal injunctions. They cared about getting their money back by any violent means necessary. Tiana's non-refundable $50,000 legal retainer was probably the only thing keeping his angry creditors from breaking his kneecaps and throwing him into the river. He was desperate, flat broke, and drowning in a sea of illegal activity. He was the absolute perfect disposable pawn for my sister's desperate extortion plot. He needed a quick, massive payday, and Tiana needed a blunt instrument to bash my life to pieces. Armed with a mountain of undeniable, terrifying digital evidence, I sent Darren a simple, direct text message proposing a meeting. I did not beg or plead or show a single ounce of the panic he was expecting. I told him to meet me at a grimy, forgotten dive bar on the industrial edge of the city, a place I knew he frequented when he wanted to feel important among the local criminals and heavy drinkers. I set the time for 11 o'clock the next morning, ensuring the bar would be mostly empty and devoid of any witnesses. The dive bar smelled strongly of stale, cheap beer, industrial-grade disinfectant, and decades of extremely bad decisions. The flickering neon beer signs buzzed loudly in the dim, smoky air, casting a sickly green and red glow across the sticky linoleum floor. I walked through the heavy wooden front doors, wearing a perfectly tailored black designer suit, my expensive leather heels clicking softly but with immense authority against the dirty floorboards. I looked completely out of place in the rundown establishment, a sleek, dangerous predator walking into a cage of rats. Darren was already sitting in a torn vinyl booth near the back of the dark room, looking incredibly smug and self-satisfied. He was wearing a cheap faded leather jacket and leaning back against the cracked seating with his legs splayed wide open, acting like he had already won the ultimate victory. A half-empty glass of cheap whiskey sat on the table in front of him. He smirked a crooked, ugly expression as I slid into the booth directly across from him. I did not order a drink. I did not remove my sunglasses. I simply looked at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out and force him to squirm in his seat. "Well, well, well," Darren drawled, crossing his arms over his chest and attempting a lazy, arrogant grin. "Look who finally decided to come crawling back to reality. Your sister told me you would be begging by the end of the week. I guess the high and mighty tech CEO is not so tough when her precious little boy is on the chopping block. I guess $50,000 buys a lot of terrible legal advice and unearned confidence," I replied, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. Darren laughed, a harsh grating sound that instantly brought back a massive flood of miserable, terrible memories from my 20s. He leaned aggressively across the sticky wooden table, trying to use his physical size and presence to intimidate me into backing down. "You are an unfit, selfish mother, Nia," he said, repeating Tiana's exact toxic, carefully rehearsed words with practiced precision. "You care more about your stupid little computer business and your fake fancy penthouse than you do about your own flesh and blood. Leo deserves a stable traditional home, not a crazy, unstable woman who snaps and ruthlessly cuts off her own loving parents over a dinner bill. You are going to sign over that loan money to your sister, and then you are going to give me primary physical custody, or I will drag you through court and completely destroy your fragile reputation." He sat back, looking incredibly proud of his little rehearsed speech. He fully expected me to break down and cry. He expected me to tremble, lower my head, and offer him whatever money he wanted just to make the terrifying nightmare stop. He thought he held all the winning cards in a rigged game. I did not argue with his insults. I did not desperately defend my parenting or my sanity. I simply reached into my expensive designer briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy black folder. I placed it firmly on the table and slowly slid it across the sticky surface until it rested directly in front of his drink. "Open it," I commanded softly, my voice barely rising above the buzzing of the neon signs. Darren scoffed, rolling his eyes heavily, but his arrogant curiosity got the better of him. He reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover, looking down at the very first page. The smug, victorious color instantly completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He was staring at a highly detailed printed ledger of his illegal offshore gambling debts, complete with account numbers, dates, and the exact names of the dangerous men he owed money to. He quickly, frantically flipped to the next page, his hands beginning to tremble visibly. He found explicit photographic evidence of his illegal sports betting operation inside the auto body shop, including the unencrypted bank transfers he used to launder the dirty money. He saw copies of Internal Revenue Service tax evasion flags and damning text messages sent to his bookies. I watched his breathing become incredibly shallow and rapid as he flipped through page after page of his own absolute total destruction. "You are an unfit, selfish man, Darren," I said, my voice cutting through the smoky air, matching the exact rhythm and cadence of his earlier insult. "You care more about your stupid illegal bets than you do about your own freedom. You owe $250,000 to men who break legs and burn down houses for a living. You have aggressively laundered money to evade federal taxes for the past 3 years. You are a miserable, desperate failure who eagerly took $50,000 from my manipulative sister because you are drowning in the absolute depths of your own pathetic incompetence." Every single word I spoke hit him like a physical, brutal blow to the chest. The arrogant, expansive posture completely vanished, replaced by the terrified, shrinking reality of a man who realized he had just brought a butter knife to a targeted drone strike. He was staring into the abyss of federal prison and violent retribution. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table and lowering my voice to a dangerous, cold whisper. My sister paid you to extort me because she thinks I am a weak, broken woman. But you are going to find out exactly how strong I am right now. You have two choices today, Darren, and you will make your decision before I leave this booth. Choice number 1 is that you walk out of this bar right now and we go to family court. If you choose that path, I will personally hand this entire black folder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS. You will easily face 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and illegal gambling operations. Your dangerous creditors will drain whatever is left of your pathetic life, and you will rot in a concrete cell until you are an old, broken man. Darren was literally shaking now, heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead and dripping down his pale face as he stared at the mountain of evidence that could instantly end his life. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was completely dry. What is choice number 2? He croaked, his voice barely a weak, pathetic whisper. I reached into my briefcase one more time and pulled out 2 crisp, perfectly formatted legal documents prepared by Evelyn. I placed a polished silver luxury pen carefully on top of them. Choice number 2, I said coldly, tapping the crisp white paper, is that you sign this document voluntarily, surrendering all of your parental rights to Leo permanently and irrevocably, right here and right now. You will then hand over your unlocked cell phone, giving me full, unhindered administrative access to every single text message, email, and voicemail Tiana sent you, orchestrating this pathetic, illegal blackmail attempt. You sign away your rights. You give me the smoking gun that proves my sister is guilty of extortion and conspiracy. And you walk away from this table a free man. If you ever contact me or my son again, the FBI gets the black folder. Darren stared at the legal documents, his hands trembling so violently he could barely pick up the heavy silver pen. He looked at the thick folder of his illegal deadly debts and then looked at me, realizing with crushing, absolute certainty that there was absolutely no way out of this trap. He was totally cornered, completely outplayed by his own staggering greed and profound stupidity. Without saying another word, he uncapped the silver pen and signed his name on the dotted lines, completely signing away his rights to the child he never actually cared about. He pushed the signed papers across the sticky table, reached into his jacket, pulled his cell phone from his pocket, unlocked it, and slid it slowly toward me. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he stood up from the torn vinyl booth. "You are a monster," he whispered, his voice filled with pure, terrified defeat and absolute horror. "No, Darren," I replied carefully, placing the signed legal documents and the unlocked phone into my briefcase, ensuring they were safe and secure. "I am a mother protecting her child from monsters. There is a massive difference." He turned and basically ran out of the dive bar, practically sprinting toward the exit and disappearing into the bright daylight of the city street. I sat alone in the dim, smoky booth, looking down at Darren's unlocked phone. The screen was still glowing brightly, showing a long, highly detailed thread of deeply incriminating text messages from my sister Tiana. She had outlined the entire extortion plot in agonizing specific detail, discussing the forged loan, the payout amounts, and her strategy to destroy my mental health in court. She was completely unaware that she had just voluntarily handed me the exact digital weapon I needed to put her and her husband in federal prison for a very long time. My own phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket, pulling my focused attention away from the screen. It was a text message from my father, Calvin. It read, "We are waiting for your signature, Nia. The bank needs the final authorization by noon. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Sign the loan paperwork, or say goodbye to Leo forever." I smiled, a cold, dark, terrifying smile that felt completely alien, but incredibly powerful on my face. I picked up my heavy designer briefcase containing the absolute total destruction of my entire toxic family and walked out of the bar, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. I stepped out of the dim, smoky atmosphere of the dive bar and into the crisp, bright sunlight of the city street, feeling an absolute profound sense of terrifying clarity. Inside my heavy designer briefcase sat the unlocked cell phone of my deadbeat ex-husband, containing every single digital footprint of my sister's malicious extortion plot. I did not drive back to my luxury penthouse. Instead, I drove directly to the secure underground parking garage of my corporate headquarters. I took the private executive elevator straight to the isolated server room on the top floor where my lead cybersecurity engineer was waiting. I handed him Darren's greasy, cheap smartphone and gave him one single firm instruction to extract every deleted text message, every hidden email, every encrypted voice memo, and every single digital breadcrumb linking Tiana and Brent to this pathetic, illegal conspiracy. Within 3 hours, my team had compiled a massive, impenetrable digital fortress of federal evidence. Tiana had meticulously outlined her entire strategy to destroy my mental health, steal my son, and force me into financial submission just to save her husband's failing logistics company. She had handed me the absolute perfect weapon to annihilate her entire existence. For the next 2 weeks, my family went completely, entirely silent. There were no more aggressive text messages from my mother, Dorothy, and no more threatening voicemails from my father, Calvin. They believed they had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner with the emergency custody filing. They fully assumed I was sitting alone in my apartment, crying, shaking, and desperately trying to figure out a way to surrender the $500,000 to keep my son Leo safe. They thought they had already won the war. Their absolute sheer arrogance was perfectly encapsulated when a heavy gold-embossed envelope arrived via specialized courier to my penthouse lobby. It was an exclusive VIP invitation to a highly publicized charity gala hosted by none other than Tiana and Brent. The event was being held at the most prestigious country club in the entire state, a place known for its exorbitant membership fees and strictly elite clientele. The invitation included a handwritten note from my mother stating that the family was ready for a public reconciliation and that they expected me to attend the gala to show my support for my sister's incredible philanthropic efforts. It was the ultimate narcissistic trap. They had invited the entire local upper echelon of society to this event. The guest list included the wealthiest local investors, prominent regional church leaders, local politicians, and the exact high society elite that my parents and sister desperately wanted to impress. Tiana and Brent were using this highly publicized charity gala to project an image of immense wealth and benevolent stability, masking the terrifying reality that their company was practically bankrupt and surviving solely on forged commercial loans. They invited me because they wanted to force a public confrontation where I would be completely cornered. They fully expected me to show up looking exhausted and defeated, playing the role of the broken, struggling single mother who was deeply, eternally grateful for her wealthy family's forgiveness. They planned to use the heavy, crushing weight of public opinion and high society etiquette to force me into smiling, taking pictures, and ultimately signing away my hard-earned wealth in the name of Christian family unity. They wanted to publicly strip me of my dignity before legally stripping me of my assets. I did not decline the invitation. I simply told my executive assistant to RSVP for one, and then I went shopping. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into their toxic narrative, purposely dressing down and staying quiet, so I would not trigger their fragile, pathetic egos. That era of my life was officially permanently over. I purchased a custom-tailored floor-length emerald green silk gown that clung perfectly to my frame and projected an aura of absolute untouchable financial power. The dress alone cost more than the cheap sedan my sister drove in college. I paired it with a sleek, minimalist diamond necklace and had my hair and makeup done by top-tier industry professionals. When I looked in the full-length mirror in my penthouse, I did not see the terrified, isolated girl they had endlessly bullied. I saw an apex predator wearing silk preparing to walk deliberately and willingly right into a den of incredibly stupid thieves. The country club was an absolute fortress of old money and desperate new money pretending to be old. As I handed my keys to the valet and stepped through the massive glass double doors, the sheer scale of Tiana's financial delusion became immediately apparent. The grand ballroom was decorated with tens of thousands of dollars worth of imported white orchids cascading from the balconies and wrapping around the massive crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the dense crowd carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and high-end hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with hundreds of wealthy, influential people mingling and laughing, completely unaware that the entire lavish production was currently being funded by massive federal bank fraud. I walked slowly into the grand ballroom, the emerald green silk of my gown moving like liquid glass around my legs. Conversations in my immediate vicinity naturally quieted down as people turned to look at me. I kept my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely serene, holding a small metallic clutch purse that contained absolutely everything I needed for the evening. I spotted my family instantly. They were holding court near the front of the room by a massive raised stage. Tiana was wearing an ostentatious, glittering gold dress, laughing loudly at a joke told by a prominent local real estate investor. Brent stood right beside her, his chest puffed out, gripping a glass of expensive scotch, and trying desperately to look like a titan of modern industry. My parents, Calvin and Dorothy, hovered right behind them, beaming with profound, aggressive pride at their beautiful, successful golden children. The moment my mother spotted me walking toward them, the smug, arrogant smile literally froze on her face. Her eyes widened, taking in the sheer, undeniable luxury of my appearance. She had expected me to walk in wearing a cheap department store dress, looking small and deeply ashamed of the custody battle hanging over my head. Instead, she was looking at a woman who radiated more authentic power and wealth than everyone else in the room combined. Tiana turned and saw me, her jaw tightening with instantaneous, furious jealousy. She quickly masked her visible rage with a wide, fake, totally plastic smile, grabbing Brent's arm and whispering something urgently into his ear. Brent looked at me and his arrogant posture stiffened visibly. He knew the $500,000 forged loan was still completely entirely unverified by my actual legal signature. He needed me to comply tonight, or his entire fraudulent empire would collapse before Monday morning. I did not approach them. I simply took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood near the back of the room, silently observing the pathetic, elaborate performance. I watched as local church leaders patted Calvin on the back, praising him for his outstanding family values. I watched as wealthy wives complimented Dorothy on her wonderful, generous daughters. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of the room was intoxicating. I spent the next hour gracefully deflecting polite conversation from curious strangers, waiting patiently for Tiana to spring her carefully orchestrated trap. Eventually, the soft ambient music faded away, and the bright overhead lights dimmed slightly, signaling the main event of the evening. Tiana walked gracefully up the short steps to the raised stage, adjusting her glittering gold dress and taking the microphone from the stand. The crowd fell into a polite, attentive silence, turning their focus entirely to the front of the room. Brent stood at the base of the stage, looking up at his wife with a perfectly manufactured expression of loving support. My parents took their seats at the primary VIP table directly in front of the podium. I remained standing near the back, my eyes locked dead onto my sister. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight." Tiana began, her voice echoing softly through the expensive sound system dripping with fake manufactured humility. "We are gathered here this evening to celebrate the incredible power of community of Christian charity and of lifting up those who are desperately struggling to find their way in this difficult world. My husband Brent and I have been so profoundly blessed by God with our thriving logistics company and our beautiful, stable home. But we know that not everyone has been granted the same incredible advantages and opportunities in life." She paused expertly, letting her words hang in the quiet air of the ballroom. She looked out across the sea of wealthy faces, making sure she had their complete, undivided attention. She was playing the benevolent, wealthy savior to absolute perfection. "Charity begins at home," Tiana continued, pressing her hand flat against her chest in a gesture of profound fake emotion. "It begins with family." As many of you know, my younger sister Nia has faced some incredibly dark, challenging times. She has struggled deeply as a single mother, working tirelessly just to make ends meet, to put food on her table, and to provide a basic life for my sweet, innocent nephew Leo. It breaks my heart to see her carry such a heavy, crushing burden all by herself, especially after she made so many difficult, unfortunate choices in her past that led to her current state of deep isolation. The entire ballroom let out a collective soft murmur of deep, profound pity. Wealthy investors and church leaders shook their heads sadly, looking around the room to find the pathetic, struggling sister being described. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the heartbroken, long-suffering matriarch. Calvin nodded solemnly, projecting the image of a strong, stoic father dealing with a deeply disappointing child. I stood perfectly still in the back of the room, the cool, smooth metal of my clutch purse resting against my palm. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Tiana. "Tonight," Tiana said, her voice rising in a crescendo of performative generosity, "we want to publicly show Nia that she is completely, entirely forgiven for all her past mistakes and her recent unfortunate outbursts. We want to show her that this family will never ever abandon her, no matter how unstable she becomes. Nia, if you are here tonight, please come up to the stage." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as people finally noticed me standing in the back. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto me, expecting to see a broken, weeping woman shuffling forward in shame and profound gratitude. Instead, they saw me walking slowly and purposefully down the center aisle, the emerald silk of my gown flowing behind me like a quiet storm. I kept my chin perfectly level, my face completely devoid of any embarrassment or fear. I could see the sudden, sharp confusion registering on the faces of the local elite as they took in my absolute, uncompromising confidence. This was not the posture of a desperate, struggling charity case. I reached the stage and walked up the short steps, stopping exactly 2 feet away from Tiana. She looked at me, her fake smile straining so hard at the edges that I thought her face might actually crack in half. She signaled to the side of the stage, and 2 men in suits walked out carrying a massive, oversized novelty check printed on heavy foam board. They turned the giant prop around so the entire ballroom could see the numbers clearly printed across the front. The check was made out to me. The amount written in bold black letters was exactly $500. It was the absolute ultimate calculated insult. It was the lukewarm hot dog on a cheap paper plate all over again, just scaled up for a massive public audience. Tiana was using this grand, elaborate stage to publicly humiliate me, attempting to cement my status as the pathetic, destitute sister who needed a meager $500 handout just to survive. She wanted the entire high society crowd to applaud her incredible, unmatched generosity while simultaneously grinding my face into the dirt. She thought this public shaming would finally break my spirit, completely forcing me to tearfully accept the prop check and then quietly sign away the $500,000 commercial loan the next morning, just to keep the fragile peace. The crowd broke into loud, sustained applause, clapping enthusiastically for Tiana's beautiful display of selfless Christian charity. Brent clapped the loudest, looking up at me with a smug, victorious sneer that made my blood run absolutely ice cold. Dorothy and Calvin stood up from their VIP table, joining the standing ovation for their perfect golden child. Tiana held the microphone out to me, her eyes burning with pure toxic malice disguised as sisterly love. She wanted me to publicly thank her. She wanted me to validate her entire fraudulent existence in front of the local elite. I reached out and took the microphone from her perfectly manicured hand. The cool, heavy weight of the metal felt incredibly grounding in my grip. I turned away from Tiana and looked out at the sea of clapping, cheering faces. I waited patiently, letting the applause slowly naturally die down until the massive ballroom was entirely silent once again. I offered a warm, bright, perfectly genuine smile to the crowd. "Thank you so much, Tiana," I said, my voice projecting clearly and flawlessly through the expensive sound system reaching every single corner of the room. "Thank you for this incredibly generous demonstration of exactly who you really are." I shifted my weight slightly, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd as I slowly, calmly unclasped my small metallic evening bag. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek black smartphone. I did not look at Tiana. I did not look at my parents. I looked straight past the sea of wealthy faces over the massive crystal chandeliers and made direct, unbreakable eye contact with the audio-visual technician sitting inside the dark elevated booth at the very back of the grand ballroom. I raised my phone slightly and gave him the exact precise nod we had arranged earlier that afternoon. The moment I gave the subtle nod to the audio-visual technician sitting in the darkened booth at the very back of the room, the entire atmosphere of the grand ballroom shifted instantly. The massive high-definition screens mounted behind the stage, which had been glowing with the pristine, elegant logo of Vanessa and Greg's fake charity foundation, suddenly flickered into absolute blackness. A heavy, confused silence fell over the hundreds of wealthy guests. They paused with their crystal champagne flutes halfway to their mouths, waiting for a heartwarming video about my supposed struggles as a single mother. Instead, the enormous screens flashed back to life, projecting a stark, blindingly bright image of highly confidential corporate banking spreadsheets. The numbers on the screen were massive and they were printed in a glaring, undeniable red ink. The Grand Charity Gala was completely illuminated by the undeniable documented proof that Greg's logistics company was currently sitting on over $2 million of toxic defaulting debt. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was audible, rolling through the room like a sudden wave of turbulent water. Prominent local investors who had just praised Greg's business acumen stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes darting frantically across the detailed financial statements displayed in 20-foot-tall letters. Vanessa was standing right next to me holding the microphone stand, her fake smile instantly dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked up at the massive screens, her face draining of all color as she realized her absolute worst nightmare was being broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. Greg stood paralyzed at the bottom of the stage stairs, his jaw dropping open in sheer horror as the meticulous facade of his wealthy, successful life was brutally, violently stripped away in front of his peers. I raised the microphone to my lips, looking out at the stunned, silent audience. My voice echoed through the expensive sound system, crisp, clear, and completely devoid of any hesitation or fear. I told the crowd that I wanted to take a moment to truly, deeply thank my sister for her incredibly generous $500 charity check. I kept my tone perfectly level as I explained that $500 was a fascinating number, especially considering that just a few days ago, Vanessa and Greg had fraudulently applied for a $500,000 commercial bridge loan to save their bankrupt company. I pointed directly to the giant screens behind me as the image shifted smoothly to the next piece of undeniable evidence. It was the official loan application featuring my name, my stolen personal identification details, and a blatant, clumsy forgery of my signature. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, morphing from polite confusion into genuine outrage and shock. I watched as the local Black elite, the church leaders who had prayed with my family, and the wealthy socialites who had endlessly praised my parents, all began to realize they were standing in a room hosted by desperate criminals. I spoke directly into the microphone, explaining exactly how Vanessa had stolen highly sensitive financial documents from my home under the guise of a family visit. I detailed how she and Greg had crossed the line from toxic family drama into massive federal identity theft, actively trying to leverage my hard-earned wealth to cover the $2 million of debt currently glowing on the screens behind us. Vanessa tried to lunge for the microphone, her hands shaking wildly, but I simply stepped back out of her reach, my eyes never leaving the audience. She was completely trapped on the stage with me, bathed in the blinding light of her own financial ruin. But I was not finished. I signaled the technician again, and the massive screens shifted to a new document. A collective shock rippled through the front tables as the high-resolution image of a certified notary stamp filled the displays. It was my father's official state seal. I looked directly down at the VIP table where my father Calvin was sitting. The respected patriarch, the pillar of the community, was staring up at the screen with an expression of absolute profound terror. I spoke into the microphone, my voice ringing with a cold, hard justice. I explained to the attentive crowd that a $500,000 commercial loan requires a certified legal witness to verify the signatures. I told them that my father Calvin had actively, knowingly, and maliciously participated in federal wire fraud by illegally notarizing the forged documents to bail out his golden child. I watched as the prominent church leaders sitting at his table physically leaned away from him, their faces registering the deep, disgusting hypocrisy of a man who preached family values while actively conspiring to defraud his own daughter. The room was descending into absolute chaos, but I maintained complete control of the narrative. I raised my hand and the crowd hushed, eager to hear the final horrifying piece of the puzzle. The screens shifted one last time, replacing the fraudulent banking documents with a long, scrolling thread of text messages. They were high-definition screenshots taken directly from the unlocked phone of my abusive, deadbeat ex-husband, Darren. I read the text messages aloud, my voice carrying the heavy, dark reality of Vanessa's ultimate betrayal. I read her exact words where she offered Darren a $50,000 non-refundable legal retainer. I read the messages where she explicitly instructed him to file an emergency petition for full physical custody of my son Leo. I looked out at the wealthy guests and explained the true depth of the depravity standing on the stage before them. I told them that Vanessa, desperate to cover her tracks and avoid federal prison, had paid a violent, unstable man to threaten the safety of my child. She had orchestrated a terrifying custody battle solely to force me into a corner, hoping I would willingly sign over the $500,000 in exchange for dropping the fraudulent lawsuit. She tried to trade the safety and well-being of her own nephew for a financial bailout. The sound of disgusted gasps and angry whispers filled the grand ballroom. People were physically recoiling from Vanessa, looking at her not as a generous philanthropist, but as a deeply disturbed, dangerous predator. The sheer weight of the public execution finally broke whatever fragile composure the family had left. The entire carefully constructed illusion completely imploded in real time. Greg realized that his investors, the men who held the keys to his future, were staring at the undeniable proof of his insolvency and criminal behavior. Absolute animalistic panic took over his body. He scrambled wildly across the front of the stage, his face sweating profusely as he desperately searched for the thick black audiovisual cables connecting the projector system. He was acting like a cornered rat trying to plunge the room back into darkness to stop the bleeding. He lunged toward the heavy power cords, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping at the shoulder. In his frantic, blind desperation, his foot caught on a thick bundle of wires. He pitched forward violently, his arms flailing in the air and face planted incredibly hard onto the polished wooden stage. The loud, echoing thud of his body hitting the floor reverberated through the silent room, a perfect physical manifestation of his complete financial and social collapse. Down in the audience, my mother Brenda realized that the family legacy was evaporating into thin air. Decades of manicured social standing, country club memberships, and carefully curated lies were burning to ashes in front of the entire city. True to her deeply manipulative nature, she resorted to the only tactic she had left. She let out a piercing, dramatic shriek, clutching her chest and collapsing heavily back into her chair. She threw her head back, faking a severe, sudden medical emergency, and began screaming for a doctor. She thrashed her arms, demanding attention, hoping to create enough chaotic distraction to pull the crowd's eyes away from the damning text messages still glowing brightly on the giant screens. But no one moved to help her. The guests simply stared at her pathetic performance, completely paralyzed and mesmerized by the horrifying truth laid bare before them. Calvin's facade shattered completely. The stoic, powerful father, who had controlled every aspect of my life through fear and intimidation, lost his mind entirely. His face turned a deep mottled shade of purple, matching the furious pulsing veins in his neck. He charged up the stage stairs, taking them two at a time, his fists clenched in blind rage. He lunged toward me, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that I shut my mouth and turn off the screens. He yelled that I was destroying the family name in front of the entire city, that I was a vindictive, ungrateful monster who was ruining everything he had built. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground on that stage, the heavy microphone still clutched firmly in my hand. As Calvin charged into my personal space, raising his hand as if to physically silence me, I stepped directly toward him. The sudden aggressive movement caught him off guard, forcing him to stop dead in his tracks. I looked directly into his furious, panicked eyes, refusing to blink. "You destroyed your own name, Calvin," I said, my voice perfectly audible to the silent listening crowd. "You destroyed your legacy the exact moment you decided to sell out your own grandson to protect your fake wealthy image. You are nothing but a common criminal hiding behind an expensive suit." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and deafening, broken only by the pathetic sound of Greg groaning on the floor and Brenda's fake theatrical weeping from the front table. Calvin stood frozen before me, his raised hand trembling as he realized he had absolutely zero power left over me. The spell was broken. The lifetime of fear and obedience he had conditioned into me was completely entirely gone. Suddenly, the heavy, ornate double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a massive, resounding bang that echoed like a gunshot through the tense, quiet air. Every single head in the room snapped around to look at the entrance. A highly coordinated team of uniformed police officers and plainclothes financial fraud detectives marched purposefully into the ballroom. Their boots hit the polished marble floors in perfect synchronized rhythm, their faces locked in grim professional determination. They did not pause to look at the expensive flower arrangements or the silver trays of champagne. They walked straight down the center aisle, cutting directly through the crowd of elite investors and socialites heading purposefully toward the stage. Vanessa let out a small, terrified whimper, dropping her oversized novelty charity check onto the floor. Calvin slowly backed away from me, his eyes wide with stark disbelief as the reality of federal consequences finally invaded his protected suburban world. Greg attempted to push himself up from the wooden stage floor, his nose bleeding slightly from the fall, but froze when he saw the badges moving toward him. I looked at the three of them, absorbing the sheer pathetic reality of their downfall. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time, the cool metal resting against my chin. I smiled warmly, looking out at the stunned, silent crowd, and then directly at my horrified family. I didn't call them. I said, my voice smooth, steady, and carrying a deep, profound sense of finality. The bank's fraud department did. The detectives ascended the short wooden stairs, their heavy radios and gear clicking softly in the quiet room. Two uniformed officers immediately grabbed Greg by the arms, hauling him up from the floor and twisting his hands forcefully behind his back. The sharp, definitive metallic snap of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly across the grand ballroom. They read him his rights, reciting the harsh federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy as the entire local black elite watched in absolute stunned silence. Another pair of detectives moved directly toward Calvin, pulling him away from the VIP table and placing him in restraints, while Brenda's fake weeping suddenly turned into very real, very genuine screams of terror. I stood perfectly still in my emerald green silk gown, watching the authorities dismantle the monsters who had tormented me for my entire life, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating air of absolute total freedom, directly in front of the prominent investors, church leaders, and high society elite who had enabled their toxic behavior for decades. My family was systematically led out of the gala in shackles, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard truth glowing brightly on the screens above. Internal security was complete, the war was over, and I had won. 1 week passed since the flashing lights of police cruisers illuminated the country club parking lot and shattered the carefully curated illusion of my family's entire existence. The immediate aftermath of the charity gala was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of absolute destruction. Greg had managed to post bail after spending 48 terrifying hours inside a federal holding cell, but his freedom was entirely an illusion. The federal authorities had immediately frozen every single asset tied to his logistics company and his personal banking accounts, leaving him completely paralyzed. The FBI had raided his corporate offices, carrying out boxes of hard drives and financial ledgers that proved he had been running a bankrupt shell company for years. The devastating ripple effect of his massive financial fraud did not stop at his doorstep. To secure the initial fraudulent loan before forging my signature, Greg and Vanessa had convinced my parents to put up their pristine suburban fortress as collateral. They had promised Calvin and Brenda that it was merely a temporary formality, just a quick bridge loan to fix a minor cash flow issue. Now, with the loan in catastrophic default and the federal fraud exposed, the massive banking institution had officially initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my parents. Their perfect manicured life, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the sprawling colonial home were evaporating into thin air right before their very eyes. I was sitting in my corner office on the top floor of my cybersecurity headquarters, reviewing the final encryption protocols for our upcoming software launch. The morning was quiet and productive, a sharp contrast to the absolute hell my relatives were currently experiencing. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office suddenly flew open, bypassing my executive assistant's frantic attempts to stop them. Brenda, Calvin, and Vanessa pushed their way roughly into my private sanctuary, looking like terrified refugees fleeing a war zone. My assistant hovered nervously in the doorway, apologizing profusely, but I simply raised my hand and signaled for her to leave us alone. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing the four of us inside the soundproof room, cutting off the gentle hum of the servers and the quiet chatter of my employees outside. They stopped dead in their tracks as the sheer, undeniable magnitude of my reality finally crashed down on them. My office was a sprawling testament to corporate power and immense wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, sweeping view of the entire city skyline. They stared with wide, shocked eyes at the massive digital operation displayed on the screens on my wall, the sleek, modern architectural design of the room, and the dozens of highly paid engineers working diligently on the floor below us. They had spent my entire life calling me a failure, a disappointment, a struggling single mother who would never amount to anything without their charitable guidance. Now they were standing inside the multi-million-dollar empire I had built entirely from the ground up, completely without them. The stark contrast between their crumbling fake wealthy image and my actual tangible empire left them momentarily paralyzed in the center of the room. They looked incredibly small and insignificant standing on the plush gray carpet of my executive suite. The arrogant superiority they had carried for decades was completely, entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate terror that was almost difficult to look at. Vanessa looked physically sick. Her expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and disheveled, and her eyes were sunken with dark, heavy circles from sleepless nights and endless legal consultations with lawyers who demanded cash up front. She stumbled forward, placing her trembling hands flat on the smooth, cool glass surface of my massive desk. She begged me to call off the high-powered attorneys. She pleaded with me to sign a retroactive authorization for the forged loan, crying that if I just signed the paper, the bank would drop the fraud charges and Greg would not have to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. She sobbed that her entire life was ruined, that her friends had completely abandoned her after the public arrest, and that she had absolutely nowhere else to turn. She told me I was her only sister and that I had to save her from this nightmare. Brenda quickly joined in, pushing past Vanessa and leaning over my desk. She started sobbing real desperate tears, pleading with me to save their beloved family home. She cried that the bank was moving incredibly fast, that the aggressive foreclosure notices were already taped to their front oak door for all the wealthy neighbors to see. She wailed that they were going to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to their names, forced to live in poverty at their age. She reached out, trying to grab my hand to force a maternal connection, but I smoothly pulled it back out of her reach, letting her hands grasp empty air. Brenda wept that I was their only hope, that I had the immense power and the money to make all of this terrible tragedy simply go away. She reminded me that she had carried me, that she had fed me and clothed me, and that I owed her my life. Calvin stood behind the two weeping women, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming, terrifying authority. The proud, harsh patriarch, who had threatened to destroy my life and expose my medical history just a week ago, was now staring at the floor, looking like a hollow, broken shell of a man. His expensive suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame. He invoked the sacred name of family, leaning heavily on the deeply manipulative guilt trip that blood is thicker than water. He told me that a good, loyal daughter could not possibly let her own parents lose everything they had worked their entire lives to achieve. He said that families make mistakes, but they always forgive each other when things get difficult, and that holding on to grudges was a sin. They begged for mercy from the exact same woman they had gleefully humiliated, mocked and betrayed time and time again. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers and watching them with a cold, detached fascination. I let their desperate, frantic pleas fill the quiet, expansive space of my office, letting them completely exhaust themselves with their own pathetic begging. Their voices overlapped in a chaotic chorus of desperation, fear, and shameless emotional manipulation. I did not interrupt them. I wanted them to feel the absolute crushing weight of the silence when they finally ran out of excuses and manipulation tactics. I watched them unravel, completely stripped of their pretentious country club masks. When they finally fell silent, looking at me with wide, terrified, expectant eyes, heavily breathing and wiping tears from their faces, I leaned forward slowly, deliberately resting my forearms on the glass desk. I looked directly at Vanessa and then at Brenda, carefully choosing to use the exact same vicious words they had weaponized against me and my young son at our anniversary dinner. I kept my voice perfectly flat and calm, an exact mirror of the cold indifference they had always shown me when I was begging for their love and support. I looked at my mother and told her that I was not running a charity organization. I watched Brenda's eyes widen in shock as I stated clearly that I should not have to pay for investments that will just go to waste. I shifted my gaze to Calvin and calmly stated that if they wanted to keep their beautiful, expensive house, they should have worked much harder in life instead of settling for total mediocrity. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as he recognized the cruel, devastating insults he had hurled at me for years when I was struggling to feed my son. Vanessa gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized exactly what I was doing. The horrifying realization that I was serving them their own toxic cruelty on a silver platter paralyzed her. Her breath hitched in her throat. I looked deep into Vanessa's terrified, bloodshot eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I told them that my wealth was not a community fund to bail out arrogant thieves and liars who like to play pretend with other people's money. I told them my money belonged to me and my son, and they would never see a single dime of it as long as they lived. I looked at Vanessa, holding her gaze with absolute chilling finality, and said, "We didn't order for your husband. You should have planned better." The absolute shock and profound horror on their faces was a beautiful masterpiece to witness. They stood frozen in front of my desk, completely unable to comprehend the reality that I was truly firmly refusing to save them. They had spent their entire lives pushing me around, abusing my boundaries, exploiting my desire for a family connection, and expecting me to eventually fold and submit to their demands. The realization that the old dynamic was permanently dead and buried shattered their minds. I told them clearly and definitively that they would not get a single penny from me. I told them I would not sign any fraudulent documents to save Greg. I would not call off the relentless federal investigators, and I would absolutely not step in to save their sprawling house from the bank foreclosure. They had made their incredibly stupid, arrogant choices betting my future to save their own, and now they were going to drown in the deep, dark consequences. I reached for my desk phone, picking up the receiver, ready to call building security to have them physically dragged out of my corporate headquarters. Panic and pure, unadulterated desperation completely fractured whatever tiny sliver remained of Vanessa's sanity. She realized that this was not a negotiation. She realized that I was truly going to let Greg go to federal prison and watch our parents lose every single thing they owned without blinking an eye. Her profound terror suddenly violently morphed into a vicious, toxic, burning rage. She lost complete control of her faculties, abandoning any pretense of begging or pleading. She lunged across my glass desk, her hands swiping wildly at my papers, her face contorted with absolute pure hatred screaming at the top of her lungs. She screamed that I was a cold, unfeeling monster, a sociopath who derived sick, twisted pleasure from torturing her own flesh and blood. But then her screaming shifted, taking on a darker, more hysterical, unhinged tone. She laughed a sharp, crazy sound that echoed off the high ceiling of my office, cutting through the sterile corporate environment. She screamed that it all finally made perfect sense why I was so inherently evil and disconnected from the family unit. She pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Calvin, who was standing frozen behind her, staring at the floor. She screamed that Calvin was not even my real father. The large office went absolutely, completely dead silent. The air in the room felt like it had suddenly been sucked out into an icy vacuum. Brenda let out a horrified, choked gasp, her hands flying to cover her face as she stumbled backward against the plush sofa. She reached out frantically to grab Vanessa's arm to silence her, to stop the horrific bleeding. But my sister violently shoved her mother away, completely blinded by her hysterical rage and her desire to cause me maximum pain. Vanessa leaned closer to me across the desk, her eyes wide and manic as she spit out the final devastating toxic family secret they had kept hidden for over 3 decades. She screamed that I was nothing but the shameful, illegitimate product of Brenda's cheap, sordid affair with a random man. She yelled that they had all always known the truth about my disgusting origins. She screamed that my very existence was a dirty, humiliating mistake that brought unending shame to the entire household and a constant reminder of Brenda's infidelity. She sneered, her face twisting into a mask of pure malice, stating that was exactly why they had always treated me like a worthless outsider, why Calvin had always hated looking at my face, and why I was never truly considered part of their perfect family. She laughed hysterically, tears streaming down her face, telling me that I never belonged to them anyway, and that I was nothing but a bastard child walking around in a fake rich costume pretending to be someone important. The echoes of Vanessa's hysterical screaming bounced off the high acoustic ceilings of my office, fading slowly into a heavy, suffocating silence. She stood there panting heavily, her chest heaving as she stared at me with wild, manic eyes. She honestly believed she had just dropped a nuclear bomb that would completely obliterate my reality. She expected me to crumble to the plush gray carpet, weeping and begging for an explanation about my true parentage. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, unable to even look in my direction, completely crushed by the sheer weight of her 30-year-old dirty secret being violently exposed. Calvin stood rigid, his face a mask of bitter resentment, waiting for my entire world to collapse. I did not crumble. I stood perfectly still behind my heavy glass desk, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of profound clarity wash over my entire body. For my entire life, I had internalized their cruelty, believing there was something inherently flawed and broken within my soul that made me unlovable. But hearing the vile truth spill from my sister's lips did not break me, it completely set me free. The absolute utter indifference, the constant emotional isolation, and the endless toxic bullying finally made perfect logical sense. I was not a broken child. They were simply common, desperate frauds punishing me for a sin I did not commit. I looked at Vanessa with eyes so dead and empty that she physically took a step backward. I told her calmly that her little revelation changed absolutely nothing about her current pathetic reality. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on my desk, instructing my security team to immediately remove the trespassers from my building. Within seconds, 4 broad-shouldered security guards entered the executive suite. Vanessa began to thrash and scream all over again, fighting against the guards as they grabbed her arms and dragged her forcefully toward the private elevators. Brenda and Calvin shuffled out behind her, their heads bowed in absolute, total, humiliating defeat. I watched the heavy frosted glass doors slide shut behind them, sealing them out of my life forever. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I picked up my phone and summoned Evelyn to my office. Evelyn was my lead forensic investigator and my top legal shark, a terrifyingly brilliant woman who specialized in unburying deeply hidden financial secrets. I told Evelyn exactly what Vanessa had screamed. I gave her a single directive to dig into my mother's past, to find the true identity of my biological father, and to figure out exactly why Calvin and Brenda had bothered to keep me in their house instead of abandoning me to the state system. Evelyn went to work with a ruthless, terrifying efficiency. For 2 straight weeks, she dug through sealed court archives, dusty county records, and archaic encrypted banking logs, tracing a dark, twisted path that had been buried for 3 decades. When Evelyn finally walked back into my office, she was carrying a thick, heavy manila folder. She placed it deliberately on the glass surface of my desk, looking at me with a cold, hard expression. She told me that the truth was infinitely worse and infinitely more calculated than a simple story about a hidden affair. My biological father was not some random passing mistake. He was a highly successful, incredibly wealthy commercial real estate developer who had tragically died in a private plane crash when I was only 6 months old. Evelyn opened the folder and spread the ancient yellow documents across my desk. Before his sudden death, my biological father had established a massive ironclad, irrevocable, multi-million-dollar trust fund in my name to ensure that my future would be absolutely secure. The sheer devastating reality of the paperwork completely paralyzed me. Evelyn calmly laid out the meticulous financial trail she had uncovered. When my biological father died, Brenda and Calvin realized they were sitting on top of an absolute goldmine, but they could not touch the money unless they had full legal guardianship. Calvin did not adopt me out of the goodness of his heart or a desire to maintain family unity. He legally adopted me simply to gain complete, total, unmitigated control over my multi-million-dollar trust fund. For 18 solid years, Calvin and Brenda had systematically, deliberately, and maliciously drained my entire inheritance completely dry. Evelyn showed me the exact banking transfers. They had siphoned millions of dollars from my account to purchase their sprawling colonial mansion. They used my dead father's money to pay for their exclusive country club memberships, their luxury vehicles, and their exotic vacations. Worst of all, they had used my stolen wealth to completely fund Vanessa's disgustingly lavish lifestyle. Every single designer dress Vanessa wore in high school, every lavish party she hosted, and every single semester of her exorbitantly expensive private college was paid for entirely by my money. They had literally stolen my past to finance their golden child. Evelyn even pulled the record of the final massive withdrawal. Calvin had drained the last remaining hundreds of thousands of dollars from my trust to seed Greg's very first failing business venture. Their entire fake wealthy empire was built entirely on my stolen inheritance. The grief over a father I never knew quickly hardened into absolute pure lethal rage. They had not just emotionally abused me for decades, they had financially enslaved me while carelessly spending my own millions to fund the very same people who mocked my poverty. The anger burning in my chest was blinding, but I channeled it into total, unwavering focus. I looked at Evelyn and told her to draft the paperwork immediately. I authorized her to file the most brutal, comprehensive, and devastating civil lawsuit this state had ever seen. We were going after them for decades of severe financial exploitation, grand larceny, systematic embezzlement, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The timing of the legal strike was absolute perfection. Greg was still out on bail, but his assets remained entirely frozen by the federal government. The bank had successfully finalized the foreclosure on my parents' house since it had been used as collateral for the fraudulent loan. Calvin and Brenda had been unceremoniously evicted by local sheriffs forced to pack whatever they could fit into Vanessa's battered sedan. They had moved into a cheap, run-down, dirty motel on the desolate outskirts of the city. That was exactly where my private process server found them. He walked right up to their peeling motel room door and handed them a massive, heavy stack of legal documents detailing my absolute intent to destroy whatever miserable fragments of their lives remained. The deposition took place 3 weeks later in a sterile, freezing cold conference room located on the 50th floor of a high-rise legal building downtown. I sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, looking completely untouchable and entirely devoid of mercy. Evelyn sat right beside me, arranging her perfectly organized files with lethal precision. Across the wide table sat the pathetic, broken remnants of the people who used to call themselves my family. They looked absolutely ravaged by their new reality. Brenda's hair was unkempt and frizzy, her gray roots showing harshly under the bright fluorescent lights. Calvin looked sickly and hollow, wearing an old suit that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. Vanessa sat slumped in her chair, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, glaring at me with dark, exhausted, hollow eyes. Sitting next to them was their cheap, court-appointed attorney, a young, sweating man who looked completely overwhelmed and terrified by the sheer mountain of undeniable evidence Evelyn had placed in front of him. The deposition was a brutal, systematic slaughter. Evelyn relentlessly, aggressively grilled Calvin, forcing him to answer questions on the permanent legal record. She made him verbally confirm his signatures on the archaic bank transfers. She forced him to read aloud the exact amounts he had stolen from a child's trust fund to pay for his country club dues. Calvin tried his absolute best to deflect, sweating profusely and stammering through his pathetic answers. He kept looking across the table at me, trying to catch my eye, trying to play the desperate father card one last time, hoping to find some tiny reservoir of pity or mercy. I simply stared back at him with dead, cold shark eyes, completely unmoved by his miserable squirming. I watched him sweat, knowing he was entirely trapped by his own decades of greed. But then a sudden, brief flash of the old, arrogant Calvin flared to life. He realized the immense timeline of the documents Evelyn was presenting. He sat up a little straighter in his cheap chair, adjusting his faded tie with trembling fingers. He looked directly at Evelyn and let out a dry, raspy, highly arrogant laugh. He puffed out his chest, looking around the room as if he had just discovered a brilliant escape route. Calvin smugly, proudly declared that none of Evelyn's fancy, expensive paperwork mattered anymore. He sneered at me, stating that the trust had been completely drained over a decade ago when I turned 18. He leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the mahogany table, and confidently announced that the statute of limitations on all of these supposed financial crimes had long since expired. He smiled a sickly, victorious smile, genuinely believing he had found the ultimate legal loophole that would let him walk away scot-free, leaving me with absolutely nothing but old, useless bank statements. He actually thought he had outsmarted us. Evelyn did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply looked at Calvin with a smile so incredibly dark and cold, it could have frozen boiling water. She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and slowly, deliberately opened a thin black folder. She pulled out a single crisp, freshly printed piece of paper. She slid it smoothly across the long, polished wood table, the paper making a soft, hissing sound, until it stopped right in front of Calvin's arrogant face. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dripping with lethal professional poison. She calmly explained to Calvin that while the vast bulk of his pathetic theft had indeed occurred in the past, arrogant criminals are very rarely smart enough to cover their tracks completely. She told him to look very closely at the date printed at the top of the banking statement. Evelyn clearly and loudly explained for the court reporter that Calvin had never actually bothered to formally close the trust fund account after he drained my millions. He had kept it open because he liked using it as a hidden, invisible rooting hub for his shady finances. Evelyn pointed a sharp, manicured finger at the paper, explaining that just last month, Calvin and Greg had purposely funneled dozens of microtransactions through my specific trust account. They had used it to bounce money back and forth to artificially inflate Greg's business assets while trying to secure their fraudulent commercial bridge loan. Evelyn smiled, showing all of her teeth, a true predator admiring her trapped prey. She softly informed him that because he had actively knowingly used the stolen trust account to commit fraud within the last 30 days, the theft was legally considered an ongoing and active criminal enterprise. The statute of limitations had just completely reset. It was a fresh, active federal crime. Calvin's face completely collapsed as the terrifying reality of Evelyn's words finally sank into his thick skull. The arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by the slack-jawed horror of a man who realized he had just built his own personal federal prison cell. The deposition ended right then and there with their chief attorney aggressively whispering at them to stop talking before they incriminated themselves any further. But the damage was already permanently done. They had handed us the absolute final nail in their collective coffin. 3 months later, we all gathered in the grand sterile expanse of federal court for the final sentencing and civil judgments. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom sealed shut behind us, trapping my family inside the exact legal nightmare they had so desperately tried to force upon me. The presiding judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, sat high at her bench, reviewing the absolute mountain of impenetrable evidence Evelyn had meticulously assembled over the past weeks. The judge adjusted her reading glasses, looking down at the massive stacks of paperwork, and then shooting a look of pure, unadulterated disgust directly at the defense table. I sat quietly next to Evelyn, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm washing over my entire body as the final curtain prepared to fall. The judge systematically read through the horrifying list of their offenses, her stern voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. She detailed the blatant, clumsy forgery of my signature on the massive commercial bridge loan, highlighting the sheer arrogant stupidity of their actions. She read aloud the vicious extortion texts where Vanessa attempted to hire my abusive ex-husband to kidnap my son just to force my hand. And finally, she spent a long, agonizing time breaking down the massive systematic theft of my biological father's trust fund. The judge looked directly at Calvin and Brenda and stated clearly, for the permanent legal record, that she had never seen such a prolonged, calculated, and utterly malicious betrayal of a child by people claiming to be parents. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel and ordered the immediate total liquidation of every single asset Calvin and Brenda still possessed. Their remaining bank accounts, their luxury cars, their pathetic retirement portfolios, and all of their hidden offshore investments were completely seized by the court to pay the millions of dollars in restitution they legally owed me for decades of grand larceny. They were officially entirely destitute, reduced to absolute poverty in the blink of an eye. Then it was Greg's turn to face the music. He stood before the judge, trembling visibly, his expensive tailored suit hanging awkwardly off his rapidly shrinking frame. He looked nothing like the arrogant, boastful titan of industry who had tried to steal my life and lock me in financial ruin. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. she sentenced Greg to 84 months in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The sound of his mother wailing loudly from the gallery filled the room as two large federal marshals stepped forward, securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs and leading him away through the side door to begin his new life behind bars. Vanessa watched her husband being hauled off to prison with completely dead, hollow eyes, unable to even shed a tear. With Greg in federal custody and the logistics company completely dismantled into worthless scrap, Vanessa's fake golden life officially ceased to exist entirely. The judge ruled that Vanessa was completely, utterly bankrupt, holding her equally liable for the financial devastation. The state seized her sprawling suburban mansion, changing the locks and putting it up for immediate public auction. Her beloved status symbol, luxury SUVs. The cars she had used to flaunt her stolen wealth were immediately repossessed by the banks. And in the ultimate final crushing blow to her pathetic, fragile social climbing ego, her highly coveted exclusive country club membership was publicly and permanently revoked due to her direct involvement in massive federal financial crimes. She was brutally stripped of her stolen money, her criminal husband, her massive home, and the only thing she truly deeply cared about, her fake high society status. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. I walked out of the heavy oak courtroom doors, stepping into the bright, echoing marble hallway, feeling an incredible, profound sense of lightness in my chest. The air actually tasted cleaner in my lungs. The heavy, toxic, crushing burden I had carried for my entire life was finally completely gone, eradicated by the bright, burning light of the truth. Evelyn walked beside me, clicking her leather briefcase shut, with a satisfied, victorious smile, knowing we had executed the perfect, flawless legal slaughter. We were heading toward the large glass exit doors, ready to step out into the crisp city air, when a small, shuffling figure stepped out from the dark shadows near the restrooms, blocking our path to the exit. It was Vanessa. She looked absolutely, completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly manicured hair was a tangled, greasy mess, and she was wearing a cheap, faded, oversized sweater that looked like it belonged in a donation bin. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and her face was red, puffy, and severely swollen from hours of crying. She looked at me with a desperate, pathetic fragility completely devoid of the arrogant, toxic venom she had possessed her entire miserable life. She held her trembling hands together in front of her chest, tightly interlacing her fingers, and begged me to stop walking. She told me she had absolutely nowhere left to go. She sobbed that Brenda and Calvin were living in a cheap, dirty motel on the edge of town, and there was no room for her and her children in the cramped space. She looked at my custom-tailored designer coat, her eyes darting frantically, and begged me for just $5,000. She cried that she just needed enough cash to put down a basic security deposit on a cheap rental apartment in a bad neighborhood so her kids would not have to sleep in the back of her battered old sedan tonight. She swore she would pay me back every single penny. She swore she would get a job. She swore she would never, ever bother me again for the rest of her life. She just needed a tiny, microscopic fraction of the massive wealth I had just reclaimed from their greedy hands. I stopped walking and looked at the broken, weeping, desperate woman standing in front of me. I searched my soul, looking for the empathy I used to carry for her. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness or pity or remorse. I felt absolutely nothing at all. I slowly reached my hand into my expensive leather evening bag. Vanessa's puffy eyes lit up with a sudden, desperate, hungry hope, truly believing that her pathetic tears had finally broken through my armor like they always used to. She reached her shaking hand out, palm up, anticipating a thick, heavy stack of $100 bills that would magically solve all her problems. I pulled my hand out of my purse and placed two small, distinct items directly into her trembling open palm. Vanessa looked down at her hand, her face contorting in massive, confused, absolute shock. Resting right in the center of her palm was a single crumpled, worn-out $5 bill and a faded, greasy paper receipt from a cheap local diner. She looked up at me, her voice cracking and trembling as she asked what this was. I looked dead into her eyes, reflecting the exact same cold, brutal indifference she had eagerly shown me my entire life when I was begging for her love. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady as I delivered the final definitive words of our relationship, closing the book on her existence forever. "Go buy a hot dog, Vanessa," I said softly. "I hear they build character." I turned on my heel, the sharp, definitive click of my designer shoes echoing loudly against the polished marble floor as I walked out the heavy glass doors and into the warm, bright sunlight, leaving her completely, entirely alone in the cold, empty hallway. 6 months passed since that final, definitive moment in the cold marble hallway of the courthouse, and the heavy, suffocating weight of my past was completely, entirely gone. It was a crisp, beautiful Tuesday morning, and the private aviation terminal was an absolute sanctuary of quiet, hushed luxury. There were no crowded security lines, no screaming passengers, and absolutely no chaotic family drama. The air smelled faintly of expensive, rich espresso and fresh lilies. I walked slowly across the pristine, polished floor, holding the hand of my beautiful, bright son, Leo. Today was his 10th birthday, and we were not celebrating with a cheap store-bought sheet cake or a forced, miserable gathering in a stuffy, highly toxic suburban living room. We were walking directly toward the massive glass doors that led out to the private tarmac, where a sleek, gleaming jet was fueled and waiting to take us directly to Paris. Leo was practically bouncing with pure, unadulterated excitement, his eyes wide as he looked at the massive aircraft that belonged entirely to us for the week. As we stepped out onto the tarmac, the quiet roar of the jet engines wrapping around us, my mind drifted briefly to the people who had tried so desperately to destroy this beautiful life. The contrast between our current reality and theirs was a masterpiece of absolute poetic justice. The harsh, brutal wheels of consequence had completely flattened their entire existence. Vanessa was no longer attending elite high society charity galas or wearing custom-tailored silk dresses bought with my stolen money. Her reality was vastly, incredibly different now. Right at this very moment, she was likely standing under the harsh, unforgiving, flickering fluorescent lights of a cheap fast food drive-through window. She was working the grueling, miserable night shift, wearing a highly unflattering, scratchy polyester uniform that permanently smelled of stale grease and old fryer oil. The woman who had once tried to orchestrate the kidnapping of my son and the theft of my entire fortune was now spending her nights handing out cheap, greasy paper bags of food to rude, impatient strangers just to scrape together enough minimum wage cash to survive another week in a terrible, dangerous neighborhood. Her perfectly manicured nails were gone, replaced by raw, blistered hands. Her arrogant, untouchable superiority had been completely, violently scrubbed away, leaving nothing but pure, grinding physical and emotional exhaustion. Brenda and Calvin were faring absolutely no better. Their sprawling, magnificent colonial mansion with the perfectly manicured lawns and the heated swimming pool was nothing but a distant, painful memory, now owned by the very bank they had tried to defraud. They were currently permanently trapped in a tiny, cramped, one-bedroom, subsidized apartment on the forgotten industrial edge of the city. The walls of their new home were paper-thin, and the hallway permanently smelled of damp, rotting carpet and boiled cabbage. Without my stolen millions to fund their lavish lifestyle and buy their fake friends, they had become complete social pariahs. The prominent church leaders and wealthy country club socialites who used to flock to their dinner parties had abandoned them instantly, treating them like highly contagious diseases, with no one left to manipulate and no one left to abuse. Brenda and Calvin had turned their deeply toxic, vicious behavior entirely onto each other. They spent their long, miserable days endlessly, relentlessly bickering within the tiny, suffocating walls of their apartment. Calvin, sitting in a cheap, broken recliner with no authority and no power left to his name, bitterly blamed Brenda for raising such a greedy criminal daughter like Vanessa. Brenda, pacing the cramped linoleum kitchen, blamed Calvin for being a stupid, incompetent fool who got caught by his own discarded child. They were completely locked inside a miserable, inescapable prison of their own making, suffocating in the exact same toxic, bitter environment they had eagerly created for me. They had absolutely nothing left but their own mutual hatred. The soft, luxurious hum of the jet engines brought my focus back to the present, beautiful moment. We settled into the incredibly plush, oversized cream leather seats of the aircraft, the cabin completely silent and perfectly climate-controlled. The flight attendant, a polite, highly professional woman with a warm, genuine smile, approached our seats, moving with quiet, effortless grace. She placed a pristine, heavy porcelain plate gently on the table in front of Leo. It was not a lukewarm hot dog on a cheap, flimsy paper plate. It was a perfectly seared, thick cut of imported premium Wagyu beef, cooked to absolute mouth-watering perfection, resting beside roasted seasonal vegetables. Leo looked up at me, his eyes shining with pure, absolute joy and innocent excitement, completely unaware of the dark, twisted monsters I had to professionally eradicate to give him this beautiful, peaceful life. He dug into his amazing birthday meal, safe, happy, and deeply unconditionally loved. The flight attendant turned to me and silently handed me a tall, delicate crystal flute filled to the brim with incredibly expensive, perfectly chilled champagne. I took the glass, feeling the cool, smooth crystal against my fingers, and watched the tiny golden bubbles rise rapidly to the surface. I looked out the small, oval window as the powerful jet lifted smoothly off the runway, soaring higher and higher above the city that had once felt like a massive, inescapable cage of emotional torment. I took a slow, quiet sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, bright liquid wash over my throat. I did not feel any lingering anger. I did not feel any sorrow, pity, or regret. I felt only the sweet, absolute, intoxicating taste of true, total independence. I had spent my entire life starving for basic human affection, sitting quietly at a deeply toxic table, begging for tiny, pathetic crumbs from people who actively wanted to see me starve. They had demanded my obedience, while secretly feeding off my very existence. But as I looked at the clouds parting outside the window, I finally understood the ultimate profound truth. You do not have to sit at a table where you are constantly disrespected, devalued, and consumed. Walking away from their toxic banquet was the absolute hardest, most painful thing I had ever done. But it was the exact required first step to building my own beautiful, untouchable empire. I had broken the heavy, suffocating chains of their abuse. I looked over at my son, safely buckled into his comfortable seat, eating his incredible meal with a bright, authentic smile. The dark, terrifying generational curse of manipulation and greed was officially, permanently broken. The dark shadows of my past could absolutely no longer touch us. I leaned back into the soft, luxurious leather of my seat, closing my eyes as a deep, quiet, completely triumphant smile spread slowly across my face. The screen fades to black. The most profound lesson from this story is that shared blood does not obligate you to endure toxic abuse. True independence requires the immense courage to completely walk away from people who intentionally tear you down, even if those people are your own parents or siblings. You must realize your own intrinsic worth and firmly refuse to let manipulative individuals drain your resources and your spirit. Building your own empire starts the exact moment you stop seeking validation from a table where you are constantly disrespected. Ultimately, your phenomenal success is your best revenge and inner peace, your greatest reward. If you have ever found the courage to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own happiness, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.